Spokane Storytime. Hey, what do river pigs, the St. Joe, and steamboats have to do with Coeur d'Alene and Spokane? Let's find out. So in the late 1800s, before they built up roads around Lake Coeur d'Alene, steamboats were the main mode of transportation around the lake. In fact, they had more steamboats than any other lake west of the Great Lakes. And a big reason for that was because of the railroad and, of course, the timber industry. So the Spokane and Inland Empire Railway ran directly down here to the docks in Coeur d'Alene, and from there you'd get on a steamboat and ride all the way across the lake to St. Mary's, Idaho. So when Frederick Post built the first Post Falls Dam in 1871, it wasn't for hydroelectricity, it was actually to raise the water levels of the lake to help with log drives, and that's how the shadowy St. Joe came to exist. The shadowy St. Joe is that stretch of river that seems to run through the middle of the lake with the flooded forest. And the St. Joe is rare because it's the longest navigatable river in the Rockies that leads directly into a lake. And that allowed steamboats to travel up the St. Joe River, and so that made St. Mary's, Idaho the perfect location for a logging town. So when the big burn of 1910 happened, there was a huge logging boom in the tiny town of Avery, Idaho. You see it left behind vast tracts of dead standing white pine and larch, also known as salvage timber. And that's when the river pigs come into play. You see, their job was to ride the log jams all the way from Avery to St. Mary's and use things like cant hooks and peaveys and long pike poles to make sure that the logs didn't get jammed up on the rocks or the riverbanks. And then in St. Mary's, they would corral them into these floating pens called log booms, and then steam tugs would take them across the lake here to the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene, where there were several sawmills. In fact, one of the biggest sawmills was built right here on Blackwell Island, which actually used to be a peninsula before they cut and dredged out the Blackwell Slough. And if you look closely, there's still some old pilings from the timber industry where they would tie up the log boom so they wouldn't float away in the wind. And then a lot of that timber was loaded up by railroad and ended up in Spokane, and it helped build the Inland Empire. And that brings me out here to the Museum of North Idaho, where you can learn all about the steamboat history, because this historical home used to actually belong to J.C. White, and he was the one who started the Red Collar Line, which was the predominant steamboat company here on Lake Coeur d'Alene. And then inside the museum here, they have several replicas and displays that show off the famous steamboats, such as the first steamboat on the lake was the Amelia Wheaton, and then the last steamboat on the lake was the Flyer that had its final voyage in 1936. And then on Independence Day in 1938, the entire community gathered to watch the fate of the very last steamboat. Just like every other steamboat, it was set on fire and sunk to the bottom of Lake Coeur d'Alene. And now you know how steamboats helped shape the Inland Empire.